Ibrahim Traoré is a symbol, and a symbol on its own is never enough. A symbol only has meaning when it is rooted in a system, in a people, in a history, in a struggle. So when young Africans celebrate Ibrahim Traoré, I urge them, do not stop at the man. Ask yourself, what system has produced him? What history stands behind him? Success in leadership or in revolution is never an individual achievement. No man liberates a nation alone. You succeed because you are part of a team. You succeed because you are part of a chain, a long chain of sacrifices, of ideas, of failures, and of victories. If we are to understand the current situation in Burkina Faso, we must resist the temptation of looking only at today's headlines. We must go back into history. In my view, that history does not begin in 2022. It begins in 1983 with a young captain called Thomas Sankara. Only when we see Ibrahim Traoré as part of that longer story, a story of betrayal and courage, of neo-colonial chains and the struggle to break them, can we truly understand why he has captured the imagination of Africa's youth and why he has become, for many, the poster boy of a new African dawn. Today, I invite you to walk with me through that story. From Sankara to Traoré, from coup d'etat to Pan-African hope, from broken promises of democracy to the search for genuine people-centered governance in the Sahel and beyond. To understand Burkina Faso today, we must return to what was once called Upper Volta. In 1983, a young revolutionary officer, Thomas Isidore Noel Sankara, took power. He did not begin with speeches about foreign investments or conferences in European capitals. He began with identity. He asked a simple but profound question: who are we? It was in answering that question that he changed the name of the country from Upper Volta, a colonial creation, to Burkina Faso, the land of upright people. That act was not merely cosmetic, it was revolutionary. It told Burkinabe men and women, you are not a footnote in someone else's empire. You are a proud people, capable of standing upright. Under Sankara, a new ethos emerged. Leaders rode in simple cars, not luxury convoys. Resources were to serve the people, not enrich a tiny elite. He spoke against odious debt and against the humiliation of Africa by former colonizers. But like many who dared to dream of a truly free Africa, Sankara's time was brutally cut short. In 1987, he was assassinated, and we now know that those who participated in his elimination included men he considered close comrades. Blaise Compaoré, his former friend, emerged as president. Yet, Sankara's short tenure marked the hearts and minds of his people and of Africa. He became a continental icon, a sign that servant leadership, courage, and integrity were not fantasy, but living possibilities. It is in that Sankarist tradition, in that memory and longing, that the rise of Ibrahim Traoré must be located. For many young Africans, he appears almost as a reincarnation of Sankara's revolutionary spirit. Fast forward to the year 2022, Burkina Faso is not at peace. The northern parts of the country are tormented by violent insurgencies claiming the banner of Islam but often serving murkier geopolitical interests. Villages are attacked, lives are shattered, citizens lose faith in those who claim to govern them. In January 2022, the government of President Roch-Marc Christian Kabore is overthrown. The accusation is clear. His administration has failed to contain, let alone defeat, the insurgency tearing apart the north. A military junta takes over, led by Lieutenant Colonel Paul-Henri Sandaogo Damiba. It promises security, stability, and a new direction. But in less than a year, in September 2022, that very junta is itself overthrown by younger officers. Among them is a captain, Ibrahim Traoré. So, in one calendar year, Burkina Faso experiences 2 coups. This is not a trivial detail. It is a symptom of a deeper crisis, a crisis of legitimacy of governance, of trust. Why then did Traoré, and not Damiba before him, so quickly become the darling of African social media, the face on the posters, the leader whose speeches circulate with subtitles across the continent? The answer lies not only in his age or his uniform, but in the decisions he made and the message he articulated. He did not merely promise to fight insurgents. He spoke the language of sovereignty, of dignity, of Pan-Africanism. He dared to confront France. He dared to question the very architecture of neo-colonial control. In doing so, he stepped directly into the unfinished chapter of Thomas Sankara, and that is why he resonated so powerfully with a generation hungry for real change. But we must widen the lens. Traoré's rise cannot be separated from the wider disillusionment with what is called democracy on the African continent. After the end of the Cold War, Africans were told forcefully and repeatedly that multi-party democracy as defined by the West was the alpha and omega of good governance. Hold elections, we were told, and all shall be well. Introduce political parties, hold periodic ballots, and development will follow. But what has been the lived experience of many Africans? In too many countries, elections have become rituals without substance. Votes are bought, manipulated, or simply ignored. The ballots themselves are often printed abroad, in Europe or elsewhere, and in not a few cases there is credible evidence that some ballots are pre-marked in favor of particular candidates before they ever reach African soil. So you may wake up at 4 in the morning, stand in a long queue under the hot sun, proudly dip your finger in indelible ink, but as one cynical observer once remarked, it is not those who vote that matter, it is those who count the votes. The result is a toxic combination. Leaders who call themselves democratically elected but govern like monarchs. Parliaments that are mere rubber stamps. Constitutions amended to extend presidential terms indefinitely. Is it any wonder that young Africans increasingly ask, what is the point of voting? Why participate in a script whose ending has already been written? It is in this context of profound disillusionment that military takeovers, once universally condemned, begin to appear to some as the only remaining shock therapy against entrenched, corrupt civilian regimes. I do not celebrate coups, but I insist we must understand why people dance in the streets when they occur. African leaders are not unaware of the dangers of coup d'etat. In 2014, in Malabo, Equatorial Guinea, heads of state and government of the African Union adopted a protocol that explicitly condemned unconstitutional changes of government. In 2022, they reiterated this commitment and even moved to strengthen continental mechanisms such as the African Court on Human and People's Rights. They defined unconstitutional change of power in 3 main ways. First, the seizure of power by the gun, the classic coup d'etat. Second, the refusal to hand over power after losing an election. Third, the manipulation of constitutional processes to extend one's stay in office. On paper, this is admirable. But in practice, the same leaders who loudly condemn the first form often practice the second and the third with great enthusiasm. From the standpoint of the African Union, therefore, the rise of Ibrahim Traoré in Burkina Faso or of Assimi Goïta in Mali or the military leadership in Niger constitutes a textbook case of unconstitutional change. Consequently, these countries have been suspended from AU activities and from regional bodies such as ECOWAS. Yet, on the streets of Ouagadougou, Bamako and Niamey, we do not see people mourning the death of democracy. We see jubilant crowds, flags waving, songs praising the military. Why this contradiction? Because for ordinary people, legitimacy is not only a legal category, it is a moral and practical one. The so-called democratically elected leaders have often stolen elections, looted resources, ordered killings, and served external interests. The military, when it appears to act against those regimes, is then seen, rightly or wrongly, as a corrective force. Thus, when we speak of unconstitutional change, we must also speak of the deeper unconstitutional reality of many African states, where the constitution lives on paper but dies in practice. What then is Ibrahim Traoré actually saying that resonates so deeply? He declares that Burkina Faso has been a neo-colonial state for far too long. He rejects the idea that France, the former colonizer, should continue to print his country's currency, to design its electoral materials, or to dictate its security arrangements. He insists that if the uranium lies under Burkinabe soil, the primary beneficiaries should be Burkinabe people. If gold is mined, if cotton is grown, if land is tilled, then the fruit must feed the nation before it enriches shareholders in Paris, London, Toronto, or Sydney. He speaks of agriculture not as a slogan, but as a foundation of sovereignty. People who cannot feed themselves cannot be free. A country that relies on imported grain when it has fertile land is a country in chains. He also calls out with unusual bluntness the international financial institutions, the IMF and the World Bank, whose prescriptions have too often deepened poverty, and he does not spare African institutions either. He questions an African Union and regional bodies that seem more eager to echo Western condemnation than to defend African dignity. To many, he sounds like a young Moses standing before a new Pharaoh, saying, "Let my people go." Africans listen to him and hear an echo of Sankara, of Nkrumah, of Lumumba. They feel that perhaps at long last someone is willing to say openly what they have whispered for decades. But let us remember, rhetoric is necessary but not sufficient. The Red Sea of neo-colonial dependency will not part merely because we shout at it. It will require strategy, sacrifice, and sustained institutional change. That, I repeat, is where the system behind the symbol becomes crucial. The events in Burkina Faso are part of a broader transformation unfolding in the Sahel. In 2021, General Assimi Goïta in Mali overthrew a government widely criticized for its failure to secure the country. In 2022, Ibrahim Traoré emerged in Burkina Faso. In 2023, soldiers in Niger removed President Mohamed Bazoum. These three states, Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger, have since walked away from ECOWAS and begun to fashion their own alliance. Why? Because they are dealing with a shared set of problems. Insurgency, terrorism, cross-border criminal networks, the exploitation of their uranium, gold, and other minerals by foreign powers and corporations, humiliation at the hands of former colonizers who lecture them on governance while extracting their wealth. So they have chosen to coordinate. They speak of a shared currency not tied to the CFA franc. They design a common passport to allow free movement among their peoples. They seek to remove tariff and non-tariff barriers that fragment a region whose borders were drawn in Berlin in 1884, 1885 with a ruler and a map, not with respect for the communities who live there. This alliance is still in its infancy. It will face enormous pressure, sabotage, and smear campaigns. But it also represents something new, an attempt at practical Pan-Africanism at the sub-regional level, not just in speeches, but in monetary security and migration policies. Burkina Faso, under Traoré, is at the heart of this experiment. That is part of why he attracts both admiration and hostility in equal measure. Many in the West ask, sometimes with feigned innocence, why are these Sahelian states turning to Russia? Why Wagner? Why Moscow? The answer, once again, is historical. Russia, or more accurately, the former Soviet Union, was not a colonial power in Africa. There is no African country that was a Russian colony. Whatever one may think of Soviet policies elsewhere, in Africa they were perceived as supporters of liberation struggles. When Western powers refused to help Egypt build the Aswan High Dam, it was the Soviet Union that stepped in. When Kwame Nkrumah in Ghana sought partners for his Pan-African vision, the Soviets were willing listeners. In Angola, they supported the MPLA. In Mozambique, Frelimo. In Zimbabwe, liberation movements. In South Africa, the African National Congress. Thus, in African political memory, Russia is not associated with colonial governors, forced labor, or the theft of cultural treasures. It is associated, rightly or wrongly, with solidarity against imperialism. Add to this the simple geopolitical fact Russia possesses significant military capabilities. In a world that still operates, as I often say, as a law of the jungle, it can be useful to have a friend whom your enemies fear. If your adversaries tremble at the mention of your ally's name, you may sleep a little easier. This does not mean Russia is selfless. No nation is. Every country pursues its interests. But compared to former colonial powers, Russia is seen as a partner rather than as a master. For Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, turning to Russia for military support, for energy cooperation, for diplomatic backing is therefore not an accident. It is a calculated response to decades of betrayal and hypocrisy from those who previously claimed to be their guardians. No analysis of Burkina Faso's situation would be complete without speaking frankly about France. For decades, Paris has treated its former colonies as pré-carrés, private preserves. They were called overseas territories in all but name. The CFA franc-tied their currencies to the French treasury. Their elites were trained in French schools. The officers were instructed in French military academies. In many ways, their sovereignty was decorative. Enter a young officer in Ouagadougou who says no more, who expels French troops, who challenges the very idea that France should print his currency or supervise his elections, who dares to renegotiate mining contracts and to welcome Russian cooperation. From the standpoint of some in Paris, this is not merely a policy disagreement. It is an affront. It wounds ego. Emmanuel Macron, in his own mind, may see himself as a latter-day Napoleon Bonaparte or Charles de Gaulle, destined to maintain France's global stature. Suddenly, in places once dismissed as mere African territories, leaders are saying, "We no longer want to be your latter-day slaves." History teaches us that wounded imperial egos can be dangerous. When colonies misbehaved, they were punished. When leaders like Sankara dared to chart an independent course, they were eliminated, often with the willing participation of those closest to them. So we would be naive to imagine that those who lose mining concessions, military bases, and monetary control will simply clap for Traoré and wish him well. No, they will seek to undermine him, to fund insurgencies, to sow division, and if they can, to remove him, perhaps with something as simple as poison in a toothpaste tube. This is the harsh world in which Burkina Faso must now navigate its emancipation. Within Africa itself, Ibrahim Traoré provokes very different reactions among leaders. First, there is a group still tightly wedded to their former colonizers. They look at Traoré and say, "We have seen such men before, Lumumba, Sankara, Nkrumah. They came, they spoke loudly, they vanished. They are comforted by the belief that the status quo will ultimately prevail." Second, there are those driven by envy and wounded pride. They see Traoré's popularity on the streets and on social media and whisper to themselves, "Why not me? Why is my name not sung in the streets?" Their criticism is less about principle and more about jealousy. Third, there is a group of leaders who are frankly afraid. They worry that what happened in Ouagadougou or Bamako or Niamey might be repeated in their capitals. Every time they hear noises in the barracks, they wonder whether a Traoré is emerging among their own junior officers. Sleep does not come easily to them. Fourth, and this is the smallest group, there are leaders who see in Traoré and his peers not just coup plotters, but a symptom of a deeper malaise. They recognize that when youth celebrates soldiers removing presidents, it is because the political class has failed them. Some of these leaders argue for engagement rather than isolation. They say, let us talk with the Sahelian governments, let us understand their grievances, let us reform ourselves before we too are swept away. The stance we take as Africans toward Burkina Faso will reveal whether we have the courage to confront our failures or whether we prefer to hide behind legal formulas while our people drown in poverty and insecurity. Let us now look concretely at what has been attempted in Burkina Faso under Traoré's leadership